Blue lights hit your rearview mirror out of nowhere. Your chest tightens just a little. You weren't speeding, at least you don't think you were. You check your mirrors again, hoping maybe it's for someone else. It's not. The siren chirps once, that's your signal. Pull over. Your hands suddenly feel heavier on the wheel. You're already replaying the last 5 minutes in your head, trying to figure out what you did wrong. You ease onto the shoulder, put the car in park, and now there's that silence. That strange, stretched out silence while the officer sits behind you, running your plate, watching you, waiting. Then comes the moment. The door opens, footsteps, a shadow at your window, and somewhere in the next few minutes, there's a very real chance you might hear this. I'm going to need to pat you down. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it. Have you ever been in a traffic stop where the officer asked to search you, your car, or even just started probing with questions that felt a little off? If you have, share that experience in the comments. What did you say? What did they say? Because later in this explanation, I'm going to point out a mistake most people don't even realize they made in that exact moment, and it changes everything about how that stop plays out. Now let's talk about what's really happening here, because this is where people get tripped up. When an officer says, "I need to pat you down," that sentence sounds authoritative. It sounds like a command. Most people hear it and assume they don't have a choice. And that assumption, right there, is where things quietly start going sideways. But here's the reality, and it's more nuanced than people think. Under US law, a pat-down, what's legally called a frisk, is not automatically allowed just because you've been pulled over. The key concept behind it comes from a Supreme Court case called Terry v. Ohio. What that case established is that an officer can conduct a limited pat-down of your outer clothing if they have reasonable suspicion that you are armed and dangerous. Not nervous, not annoyed, not avoiding eye contact, not because it's routine, armed and dangerous. That's a very specific standard, and yet, in real-world traffic stops, that line gets blurry fast. Because here's how it usually plays out in reality. The officer walks up, greets you, asks for license and registration. Maybe they make small talk, maybe they don't. Then come the questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Anything illegal in the vehicle? Now pay attention to this part, because this is where psychology kicks in. These questions are not just about information, they're about observation. The officer is watching how quickly you respond, whether your story makes sense, whether your hands are steady, whether your voice changes, whether you over-explain or under-explain, whether you seem too calm or too nervous. People think they're being judged on what they say. In reality, they're often being judged on how they say it. And that pressure builds. Silence feels uncomfortable, so people start talking more than they should. Then comes a shift. Would you mind stepping out of the vehicle? Now your heart rate ticks up another notch. You step out. The air feels different outside the car. You're more exposed, more visible. And this is often where the tone changes just slightly. Do you have anything on you I should know about? Notice the phrasing. It's not an accusation. It's not a direct claim. It's an invitation to volunteer information. Most people answer quickly. No. Sometimes too quickly. And then comes that line. I'm going to need to pat you down. Now here's the part almost nobody prepares for. There are two very different scenarios hiding inside that one sentence. In one scenario, the officer is asserting legal authority based on reasonable suspicion. In that case, they may proceed whether you agree or not. In the other scenario, and this happens more often than people think, the officer is actually testing whether you will consent. And the difference between those two scenarios depends heavily on how you respond in that moment. This is where the one sentence comes in. If you remember nothing else from this entire conversation, remember this. I do not consent to any searches. That's it. Simple, calm, clear. No attitude, no sarcasm, no raised voice. I do not consent to any searches. Now let's slow that down, because the way you say it matters just as much as what you say. You're not arguing, you're not accusing, you're not escalating. You're stating a boundary. Because here's what a lot of people don't realize. Consent is one of the most powerful tools officers rely on during traffic stops. If you give it, even casually, even unintentionally, you can eliminate entire layers of legal protection without realizing it. People think consent has to be explicit, like saying yes. It doesn't. Consent can be implied through compliance. If an officer says, "I'm going to pat you down," and you silently raise your arms, that can be interpreted as consent. If you hesitate, shrug, or say something like, "I guess," that can be taken as consent. Even stepping into position without objection can muddy the waters. And once consent is established, challenging that search later becomes significantly harder. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. What happens after you say, "I do not consent to any searches"? The officer might pause. They might look at you differently. They might ask again, in a slightly different way. Why not? If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem, right? This is a pressure point, a psychological one, because now it feels like you're being judged. Like saying no makes you look guilty. And this is exactly where people fold. They start explaining. I just don't like searches. I've had bad experiences before. I'm just trying to be careful." Stop right there. Every extra word increases risk, because now you're back in the game of talking, explaining, justifying, and that's where inconsistencies creep in. The strongest position is the simplest one. "I do not consent to any searches." And then silence. Yes, silence feels awkward. It feels unnatural. But silence is not illegal. Silence does not give the officer evidence. Silence does not create contradictions. Now let's be very real about something. Saying that sentence does not guarantee the officer will stop. If they believe they have legal grounds, they may proceed anyway. They might say, "I'm going to do it for my safety." They might reposition you, guide your hands, start the pat down. And this is where another mistake happens, a dangerous one. People start physically resisting, pulling away, turning, blocking. Do not do that. Because now you've shifted the situation from a legal question into a physical one, and that escalates fast. Your goal is not to win the argument on the roadside. Your goal is to preserve your rights without creating additional charges or risk. So if it happens anyway, you stay calm. You do not resist. But you've made your position clear. That matters later. And this is the part most people never think about in the moment. Traffic stops are not just about what happens on the roadside. They're about what can be challenged afterward. Body camera footage, audio recordings, officer reports. If there's ever a question about whether a search was lawful, your clear verbal refusal becomes a critical piece of context. Without it, the narrative often defaults to cooperation. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. Sometimes, the pat-down itself isn't even the main objective. It's a doorway. During a pat-down, if an officer feels something they believe could be a weapon or contraband, that can justify further action. Pockets get checked, items get removed, questions intensify, and suddenly, what started as a quick safety check turns into a much deeper search. This is why that initial moment, the sentence you choose, the tone you use, the body language you show, is so important. Because officers are constantly reading signals. If you appear overly eager to comply, that tells them one thing. If you appear defensive and aggressive, that tells them another. But if you are calm, steady, and clear, no consent, no resistance, that creates a very different dynamic. Now let's shift slightly, because there's another layer people overlook. Passengers. If you're not alone in the vehicle, things get even more complicated. Officers may speak to passengers separately. Ask them similar questions. Compare answers. Where are you guys coming from? How long have you known the driver? Whose car is this? Inconsistent answers raise suspicion quickly. And if one person consents to something while another refuses, that creates confusion that often benefits the officer. So understanding your rights isn't just an individual responsibility, it affects everyone in the car. Now let me bring up a scenario that happens more often than people admit. The officer doesn't immediately ask to pat you down. Instead, they prolong the stop. They keep your license. They return to their vehicle. They come back. More questions. Time stretches. You start thinking, why is this taking so long? And eventually, fatigue sets in. You just want it to be over. So when they finally ask, mind if I check you real quick? People say yes, just to end the situation. That's not accidental. Time pressure is a tactic. The longer the stop feels, the more likely people are to give up resistance, not because they're guilty, but because they're tired. And that's exactly why having a prepared response matters. Because in that moment, you're not thinking clearly, you're reacting, and rehearsed clarity beats emotional reaction every time. Now here's something I hinted at earlier. The mistake people don't realize they made. It's not always what they said, it's when they said it. Timing matters more than people think. If you wait too long to assert your lack of consent, after you've already cooperated, after you've already answered a series of questions, after you've already complied with positioning, it becomes less effective. Not useless, but weaker. Because the narrative has already started forming. Early, clear, calm boundaries carry more weight than late objections. That doesn't mean you're out of options if you didn't say it right away, but it does mean your position becomes harder to defend later. So the goal is not perfection, it's awareness. Understanding that every small interaction during a traffic stop contributes to a bigger picture. The questions, the pauses, the tone, the silence, and most importantly, your response when that key moment arrives. I do not consent to any searches. Simple doesn't mean powerless. In fact, in this context, simple is exactly what makes it effective. Because it cuts through confusion, it removes ambiguity, it anchors your position without escalating the situation. And if you ever find yourself on the side of the road again, blue lights flashing behind you, heart beating just a little faster than usual, that sentence might be the one thing that keeps the situation from quietly slipping in a direction you never intended. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just clear. And sometimes that clarity is the only thing standing between a routine stop and something much more complicated.